town of Superior, Ohio, disappeared on the night of October 31. A truck driver named Pierce Knobloch was the first to report it. He had been highballing west along Route 202, making up for the time he'd spent over a second cup of coffee in a diner, when he screeched to a stop. If he'd gone another 25 feet, he'd have gone into the pit where Superior had been. Knobloch couldn't see the extent of the pit because it was too dark, but it looked big. Bigger than if a nitro truck had blown up, which was his first thought. He backed up 200 feet, set out flares, then sped off to a telephone. The state police converged on the former site of Superior from several directions. Communicating by radio phone across the vast pit, they confirmed that the town undoubtedly was missing. They put in a call to the National Guard. The Guard surrounded the area with troops. More than 1,000 were needed to keep people from falling into the pit. A pilot who flew over it reported that it looked as if a great ice cream scoop had bitten into the Ohio countryside. The Pennsylvania Railroad complained that one of its passenger trains was missing. The train's schedule called for it to pass through, but not stop at Superior at 11:58. That seemed to fix the time of the disappearance at midnight. The truck driver had made his discovery shortly after midnight. Someone pointed out that October 31 was Halloween, and that midnight was the witching hour. Somebody else said, nonsense, they'd better check for radiation. A civil defense official brought up a Geiger counter, but no matter how he shook it and rapped on it, it refused to click. A National Guard officer volunteered to take a jeep into the pit, having found a spot that seemed navigable. He was gone a long time, but when he came out on the other side, he reported that the pit was concave, relatively smooth, and did not smell of high explosives. He found no people, no houses, no sign of anything except the pit itself. The governor of Ohio asked Washington whether any unidentified planes had been over the state. Washington said no. The Pentagon and the Atomic Energy Commission denied that they had been conducting secret experiments. Nor had there been any defense plants in Superior that might have blown up. The town's biggest factory made kitchen sinks, and the next biggest made bubble gum. A United Airlines pilot found Superior early on the morning of November 1st. The pilot, Captain Ed Studley, who had never seen a flying saucer and hoped never to see one, was afraid now that he had. The object loomed out of a cloud bank at 12,000 feet, and Studley changed course to avoid it. He noted with only minimum satisfaction that his co-pilot also saw the thing, and wondered why it wasn't moving at the terrific speed flying saucers were allegedly capable of. Then he saw the church steeple on it. A few minutes later, he relayed a message from Superior, formerly of Ohio, addressed to whom it might concern. It said that Superior had seceded from Earth. One other radio message came from Superior, now airborne, on that first day. A ham radio operator reported an unidentified voice as saying plaintively, "Hold up here." Don Ford had been dozing in what passed for the club car on the Buckeye Cannonball when the train braked to a stop. He looked out the window, hoping this was Columbus, where he planned to catch a plane east. But it wasn't Columbus. All he could see were some lanterns jogging as trainmen hurried along the tracks. The conductor looked into the car. The redhead across the aisle, in whom Don had taken a passing interest earlier in the evening, asked, "Why did we stop?" "Somebody flagged us down," the conductor said. "We don't make a station stop at Superior on this run." The girl's hair was a subtle red, but false. When Don had entered the club car, he'd seen her hatless head from above, and noticed that the hair along the part was dark. Her eyes had been on a book, and Don had the opportunity for a brief study of her face. The cheeks were full and untouched by makeup. There were lines at the corners of her mouth, which indicated a tendency to arrange her expression into one of disapproval. The lips were full like the cheeks, but it was obvious that the scarlet lipstick had contrived a mouth a trifle bigger than the one nature had given her. Her glance upward at that moment interrupted his examination, which had been about to go on to her figure. Later, though, he was able to observe that it was more than adequate. If the girl had given Don Port more than that one glance, or if it had been a trained, all-encompassing glance, she would have seen a man in his mid-20s, about her age, lean, tall, and straight-shouldered, with once blonde hair now verging on dark brown, a face neither handsome nor ugly, and a habit of drawing the inside of his left cheek between his teeth and nibbling at it thoughtfully. But it was likely that all she noticed then was the briefcase he carried, attached by a chain to a handcuff on his left wrist. "Will we be here long?" Don asked the conductor. He didn't want to miss his plane at Columbus. The sooner he got to Washington, the sooner he'd get rid of the briefcase. The handcuff it was attached to was one reason why his interest in the redhead had been only passing. "Can't say," the conductor told him. He let the door close again and went down to the tracks. Don hesitated, shrugged at the redhead, said, "Excuse me," and followed the conductor. About a dozen people were milling around the train as it sat in the dark, hissing steam. Don made his way up to the locomotive and found a bigger knot of people gathered in front of the cowcatcher. Some sort of barricade had been put up across the tracks, and it was covered with every imaginable kind of warning device. There were red lanterns, both battery and electric, flashlights, road flares, and even an old red shirt. Don saw two men who must have been the engineer and the fireman talking to an old bearded gentleman wearing a civil defense helmet, a top coat, and riding boots. "You go over the edge, I tell you," the old gentleman was saying. "If you don't get this junk off the line," the engineer said, "I'll plow right through it. Off the edge? You crazy or something?" "Look for yourself," the old man in the white helmet said. "Go ahead, look." The engineer was exasperated. He turned to the fireman. "You look. Humor the old man. Then let's go." The bearded man, he called himself Professor Garrett, went off with the fireman. Don followed them. They had tramped a quarter of a mile along the gravel when the fireman stopped. "Okay," he said, "where's the edge? I don't see nothing." The tracks seemed to stretch forever into the darkness. "It's another half mile or so," the professor said. "Well, let's hurry up. We haven't got all night." The old man chuckled. "I'm afraid you have." They came to it at last, stopping well back from it. Professor Garrett swelled with pride, it seemed, as he made a theatrical gesture. "Behold," he said, "something even Columbus couldn't find. The edge of the world." True, everything seemed to stop, and they could see stars shining low on the horizon where stars could not properly be expected to be seen. Don Port and the fireman walked cautiously towards the edge, while the professor ambled ahead with the familiarity of one who had been there before. But there was a wind, and they did not venture too close. Nevertheless, Don could see it apparently was a neat, sharp edge, not one of your old ragged, random edges, such as might have been caused by an explosion. This one had the feeling of design behind it. Standing on tiptoe and repressing a touch of giddiness, Don looked over the edge. He didn't have to stand on tiptoe any more than he had to sit on the edge of his seat during the exciting part of a movie, but the situation seemed to call for it. Over the edge could be seen a big section of Ohio. At least, he supposed it was Ohio. Don looked at the foreman, who had an unbelieving expression on his face, then at the bearded old man, who was smiling and nodding. "You see what I mean," he said. "You would have gone right over. I believe you would have had a 2-mile fall." "Of course, you could have stayed aboard the train," the man driving the old Pontiac said. "But I really think you'll be more comfortable at Cavalier." Don Port, sitting in the back seat of the car with the redhead from the club car, asked, "Cavalier?" "The college. The institute, really. It's not accredited. What did you say your name was, miss?" "Jen Jervis," she said. "Geneva Jervis, formally." "Miss Jervis, I'm Civic. You know Mr. Port, I suppose?" The girl smiled sideways. "We have a nodding acquaintance." Don nodded and grinned. "There's plenty of room in the dormitories," Civic said. People don't exactly pound on the gates and scream to be admitted to Cavalier. Are you connected with the college? Don asked. Me? No, I'm the mayor of Superior. The old town's really come up in the world, hasn't it? Overnight, Gina Jervis said. If what Mr. Court and the firemen say is true, I haven't seen the edge myself. You'll have a better chance to look at it in the morning, the mayor said, if we don't settle back down in the meantime. Was there any sort of explosion? Don asked. No, there wasn't any sensation at all, as far as I noticed. I was watching The Late Show, or trying to. My house is down in a hollow, and reception isn't very good, especially with old English movies. Well, all of a sudden the picture sharpened up, and I could see just as plain. Then the phone rang, and it was Professor Garrett. The old fellow with the whiskers and the riding boots? Jen Jervis asked. Yes, Osbert Garrett, professor of magnology at the Cavalier Institute of Applied Sciences. Professor of what? Magnology. As I say, the school isn't accredited. Well, Professor Garrett telephoned and said, Hector, that's my name, Hector Civic. Everything's up in the air. He was having his little joke, of course, I said. What? And then he told me. Told you what? Jen Jervis asked. I mean, does he have any theory about it? He has a theory about everything. I think what he was trying to convey was that this levitation confirmed his magnology principle. What's that? Don asked. I haven't the faintest idea. I'm a politician, not a scientist. Professor Garrett went on about it for a while on the telephone, about magnetism and gravity, but I think he was only calling as a courtesy, so the mayor wouldn't look foolish the next morning, not knowing his town had flown the coop. What's the population of Superior? 3,000, including the students at the Institute. 3,040, counting you people from the train. I guess you'll be with us for a while. What do you mean by that? Jen Jervis asked. Well, I don't see how you can get down, do you? Does Superior have an airport? Don asked. I've got to get back to Earth. It sounded odd to put it that way. Nope, Civic said. No airport. No place for a plane to land either. Maybe not a plane, Don said, but a helicopter could land just about anywhere. No helicopters here either. Maybe not, but I'll bet they'll be swarming all over you by morning. Said Hector Civic. Don couldn't quite catch his expression in the rearview mirror. I suppose they could at that. Well, here's Cavalier. You go right in that door where the others are going. That's Professor Garrett. I've got to see him. Excuse me. The mayor was off across the campus. Don looked at Geneva Jervis, who was frowning. Are you thinking, he asked, that Mayor Civic was perhaps just a little less than completely honest with us? I'm thinking, she said, that I should have stayed with Aunt Hattie another night, then taken a plane to Washington. Washington, Don said. That's where I'm going. I mean, where I was going before Superior became airborne. What do you do in Washington, Miss Jervis? I work for the government. Doesn't everybody? Not everybody. Me, for instance. No, she said. Judging by that satchel you're handcuffed to, I'd have thought you were a courier for the Pentagon, or maybe State. He laughed quickly and loudly because she was getting uncomfortably close. Oh no, nothing so glamorous. I'm a messenger for the Riggs National Bank, that's all. Where do you work? I'm with Senator Bobby Thiebaud, S.O.B. Don laughed again. He sure is. Mr. Quirk, she said, annoyed. You know as well as I do that S.O.B. stands for Senate Office Building. I'm his secretary. I'm sorry. We better get out and find a place to sleep. It's getting late. Places to sleep, she corrected. She looked angry. Of course, Don said, puzzled by her emphasis. Come on, where they put you, you'll probably be surrounded by co-eds, even if I could get out of this cuff. He took her bag in his free hand, and they were met by a gray-haired woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Garrett. We'll try to make you comfortable, she said. What a night, eh? The professor is simply beside himself. We haven't had so much excitement since the Cosmolineator blew up. They had a glimpse of the professor still in his CD helmet, going around a corner, gesticulating wildly to someone wearing a light laboratory smock. Chapter 2. Don Fort had slept, but not well. He had tried to fold the briefcase to pull it through his sleeve so he could take his coat off, but whatever was inside the briefcase was too big. Cavalier had given him a room to himself at one end of a dormitory, and he'd taken his pants off, but had had to sleep with his coat and shirt on. He got up feeling gritty and did what little dressing was necessary. It was 8 o'clock according to the watch on the unhandcuffed wrist, and things were going on. He had a view of the campus from his window. A bright sun shone on young people moving generally toward a squat building, and other people going in random directions. The first were students going to breakfast, he supposed, and the others were faculty members. The air was very clear and the long morning shadows distinct. Only then did he remember completely that he and the whole town of Superior were up in the air. He went through the dormitory. A few students were still sleeping. The others had gone from their unmade beds. He shivered as he stepped outdoors. It was crisp, if not freezing, and his breath came out visibly. First he'd eat, he decided, so he'd be strong enough to do a good look over the edge in broad daylight to the earth below. The mess hall, or whatever they called it, was cafeteria style, and he got in line with a tray for juice, eggs, and coffee. He saw no one he knew, but as he was looking for a table, a willowy blonde girl smiled and gestured to the empty place opposite her. "You're Mr. Cork," she said. "Won't you join me?" "Thanks," he said, unloading his tray. "How did you know?" "The mystery man with a handcuff. You'd be hard to miss. I'm Alice. That's A-L-I-S, not A-L-I-C-E, Garrett. Are you with the FBI, or did you escape from jail?" "How do you do?" "No, just a bank messenger." "What an unusual name. Professor Garrett's daughter?" "The same," she said. "Also the only. A pity, because if there'd been two of us, I'd have had a 50-50 chance of going to OSU. As it is, I'm duty-bound to represent the second generation at the nut factory." "Nut factory? You mean Cavalier?" Don struggled to manipulate knife and fork without knocking things off the table with his clinging briefcase. "Here, let me cut your eggs for you," Alice said. "You'd better order them scrambled tomorrow. Yes, Cavalier, home of the crackpot theory and the latter-day alchemist." "I'm sure it's not that bad." "Thanks. As for tomorrow, I hope to be out of here by..."